All right, we've got a massive geopolitical event on our hands. So let's just jump right in and unpack it all. What happened, why it happened, and what could possibly come next.
So instead of a slow buildup, we're going to start right in the thick of it. Let's go to the moment the world first found out this strike was even happening. So picture this, January 3rd, 2026. It's the pre-dawn hours in Caracas, Venezuela. Suddenly, the entire capital is just rocked by a series of explosions. Chaos. It wasn't until later that U.S. officials confirmed what was really going on. Elite special ops teams, we're talking Delta Force, were already on the ground. They were running a super fast operation, hitting key military sites and going after leadership.
And as you can imagine, those first reports coming out were just chaotic. You had this quote from Reuters just talking about smoke and loud noises. It was clear something big was happening, but nobody knew what. The city was in total confusion. Venezuelan state media was basically scrambling, trying to figure out what to even say, all while the government is declaring a state of emergency. And then, bam, the announcement drops from the White House right on Truth Social. President Trump says the U.S. has carried out a huge strike. And not just any strike, President Maduro and his wife were captured and flown out of the country. Just like that. A full-on decapitation strike. And suddenly everyone, and I mean everyone, was asking the same question. How on earth did we get? Okay, so to really get how this all went down, you have to look at the buildup. This thing wasn't a surprise attack that just came out of the blue. No, it was more like the final step on a ladder of escalation that had been deliberately climbed for months. And this timeline really lays it all out. You can see how methodical this was. It starts back in late summer 2025. The U.S. basically shifts gears, moving away from just sanctions to actual military action. It all gets framed as a war on narco-terrorism, right? So first, they start hitting suspected smuggling boats in the Caribbean. Then, a massive U.S. naval presence builds up in the area. And the final piece? The CIA gets the green light for covert drone strikes inside Venezuela. You see? Each step was a deliberate turn of the screw, all leading right to this operation. So publicly, the whole story was about fighting drug trafficking. That was the official reason for everything. But, when you peel back that layer, you find these classic geopolitical motives. We're talking about wanting to secure control over a major oil producer, and of course, rolling back a regime that was friendly with Russia and Iran. Classic great power politics.
Right, so that's the big question, isn't it? Why now? What made the White House finally pull the trigger at this exact moment?
Well, the timing was anything but random. It was a super calculated move. You had this convergence of intelligence, military power, and political timing that created what was basically a perfect storm, or, from Washington's perspective, the perfect window of opportunity. Let's break down how those three factors came together. First, the intelligence. Reports say a CIA asset deep inside the Venezuelan government gave them a golden nugget, a very narrow window with Maduro's exact location. Step two, military dominance. The U.S. already had an armada parked in the Caribbean, so they controlled the sea and the air. And third, the political timing. The administration basically did the math and figured, yeah, we can handle the international blowback on this.
But, and this is a huge but, there was one massive risk: the American public. Look at this number. A whopping 70% of Americans were against a full-blown military intervention in Venezuela. That is a major, major political problem for any administration. And this is where you can really see the political strategy at play. They needed a way to thread that needle. So instead of a big war, they chose a short, high-impact raid. The goal? A spectacular, made-for-TV success story. You get the bad guy, you avoid a long, unpopular war like Iraq, and you don't risk a lot of U.S. casualties. It's all about getting the biggest political win for the smallest possible risk.
Now, you can't talk about the politics of this without talking about Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He's really been the architect of this whole strategy. For years, he pushed this narco-terrorist narrative. And what that does is it blurs the line between a foreign policy issue and a law enforcement issue, which makes it a whole lot easier, politically, to justify using military force.
And that framing led to a huge debate over whether this whole thing was even legal. On one side, you have the U.S. saying, hey, this is just law enforcement. We had an indictment, we were making an arrest, like going after a cartel boss. But on the other side, you have pretty much the entire world of international law saying, whoa, hold on, you can't just do that. That's a violation of sovereignty. It's basically an act of war. Okay, so Maduro is gone. But what happens next? Well, you get an immediate and dangerous power vacuum in Caracas. And the big question becomes, who's going to step up and fill it?
And it looks like there are basically three main contenders, three possible paths forward. First, you've got the constitutional successor, the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. The problem? She's seen as just more of the same, part of Maduro's inner circle. Then you have the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado. She's a Nobel winner, well-respected, but she runs the huge risk of being seen as a puppet installed by the U.S. And then the wild card, the military. They're still the real power broker here, and they could throw their weight behind anyone, or no one. So the raid itself might be over in a matter of hours, but the consequences? Oh, they're just starting to ripple out. And it's created this huge cloud of uncertainty, not just for Venezuela, but for the whole region.
And here's the critical thing to remember. You can take out the leader, but that doesn't mean you've taken out the whole system that supported him. The Chavista movement still has a dedicated base. Plus, you've got these armed paramilitary groups, the colectivos, who could easily become the core of a nasty resistance. That's a recipe for long-term violence and chaos.
The international reaction? It was exactly what you would expect. Fast, predictable, and totally split down the usual geopolitical lines. Of course, Russia, Iran, and Cuba came out with harsh condemnations. European allies were, calling for restraint. But here's the key thing. Some important allies in the region, like Argentina, actually came out in support of the move. And that gave the U.S. some much-needed political cover right in its own backyard.
So at the end of the day, the raid closed one chapter for sure, but it blew open a whole bunch of new ones. And that leaves us with the ultimate question. Is this the beginning of a democratic rebirth for Venezuela, or is it the opening shot in a brand new, long-term conflict in the Americas? The answer to that is going to be written in the chaotic days and weeks ahead, and it will define the future for the entire hemisphere.